Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Talking Hockey Sense. I'm Chris Peters. This is episode 77 of the podcast, the Ray Bork edition, let's call it, because we have a lot of fun stuff going on right now. It is the most fun time of year in hockey with the Stanley Cup playoffs, the Calder Cup playoffs, the CHL playoffs, the ECHL playoffs, which you'll be able to see on FloHockey. We'll talk about that today. But the postseason is here. We also have the World U18 Championship. NHL Central Scouting just put out their final draft rankings. I mean, let's just say it. Everything is happening, and that is what is going on right now. And that is what we are going to talk about on Talking Hockey Sense this week. So before we get into everything, just want to remind you, as always, if you have not yet and you like to listen to this podcast, make sure it is downloaded. You are subscribed to it. Leave us a kind rating and review if you would. That really does seem to help. We've gotten a lot of great ones over the years and really appreciate the audience that's been with us from before the Flow days to even now. And we're going to continue to make the show better as much as we can. So hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Also, you can watch every episode of this podcast on YouTube or on FloHockey via the Flow Sports app, or certainly on your desktop or phone. It is a great way to interact with us, and we love anyway you find this podcast. So hopefully you guys are enjoying it. But we have so much to get to and not a whole lot of time because things are really, really busy around here. As I mentioned, the Kelly Cup playoffs are just about to get underway. And that's where we're going to start today because the ECHL is a league that maybe doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. It is one of the feeder leagues, part of the NHL farm system, every team affiliated with an NHL team. And there has, especially this year, it's just some phenomenal hockey across the ECHL, and wanted to kind of break that down a little bit. We've got, 16 teams remaining in the hunt here for the Kelly Cup, which is, a very coveted trophy and certainly one that teams are going to be battling after quite hardly this year because, boy, I'll tell you what, there were some phenomenal performances, but there was none better than the team performance of the Idaho Steelheads this year, an ECHL record 58 wins. It is, that record stood for more than 20 years, and the Steelheads pretty much just obliterated it. They won the regular season title a month ago, and now they're going to play in their first round series here against, a team that kind of found their way. They had to battle their way into the playoffs in the Utah Grizzlies. And in the Mountain Division, the ECHL uses divisional playoff structure. So they'll play within their divisions in the playoffs. So great rivalries and a lot of teams that are very, very familiar with each other play in the first round. So it's a very chaotic kind of, just amazing couple of weeks of hockey where we expect very close series. But, Utah's got their hands full. They've got the number one team in the league in Idaho that they're going to have to play. They get that series rolling Wednesday. There's a lot of other things that'll be happening, but wanted to talk about some of the other top teams and other top performances, and also wanted to call attention to one of the best individual performances of the season. And that belongs to Hank Crone of the Allen Americans. 105 points this year. He just won the league's Rookie of the Year. That's right, he's a rookie. He won the Rookie of the Year award this year and just had a sensational season on the scoring front. 105 points. He's the first player since 2016-17 to eclipse the 100-point mark in a season. So Hank Crone of the Allen Americans, that's going to be a fascinating matchup with him playing the Kansas City Mavericks. He's a guy to watch for sure. And it's funny because the last guy that eclipsed 100 points in the ECHL is now Hank Crone's head coach, Chad Costello, who's a legend of the league in his first season as a head coach. So should be a very fascinating series there. Also, I think a lot of eyes are going to be on the Toledo Walleye for a number of reasons. The Detroit Red Wings affiliate, they have Sebastian Cossa, who's a top prospect. They also have John Leatherman, who was a top-tier goaltender in the ECHL this season, one of the best in the league. And he has now been returned from AHL Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids didn't make the Calder Cup playoffs this year. They're going through a coaching change. So they've gotten, the Toledo has gotten a lot of players, I think 7 or 8 players from the Griffins sent down, including top prospects like Emil Viro and Donovan Sabrango. And then, of course, they already had Cossa. So a lot of really good talent on Toledo's roster, and they're looking to bounce back. We highlighted them early in the season. We did a mini documentary at their training camp. They fell just short of the Kelly Cup last year. They have not won the Kelly Cup since Toledo has been the Walleye. They have had a very rich hockey tradition, but this is a team that very much believes that it can win it all. And they've got TJ Hensick, they've got John Albert, they've got, Simone Denis, who came back after a couple of years in Asia. They've got a lot. Brandon Hawkins, who is, if you've never seen Brandon Hawkins shoot a puck, he's one of the top goal scorers in the ECHL and has been for the last couple of seasons. I mean, he is as good a sniper as you're going to see at any level. So definitely Toledo is going to be a big team to watch. The Newfoundland Growlers as well. Big time team. They had great offensive performance throughout. They've had good goaltending. They've gotten great support from the Toronto Maple Leafs, who have sent a lot of guys between the Toronto Marlies and Newfoundland. They managed to get Pavel Gogolev back. So this is a team that is very dangerous offensively, and they get their series rolling. It's Adirondack, who had to get into the playoffs on the very last day of the regular season. On Saturday, they were playing the Worcester Railers, and in that game, this is something you will almost never see. The Railers had to win in regulation. The game was tied late in the third period. Even though the game was tied, the Railers pulled their goaltender. Adirondack scores an empty net goal. They advanced. They only needed 1 point in that game. The Railers needed 2, so it was something the Railers had to do, and that is how we ended the regular season. So it went down to the wire. So if the battle to get into the playoffs was that intense, you can only imagine how intense it's going to be when all of these teams go head-to-head for the Kelly Cup. It's all on FloHockey. You can go to flohockey.tv for an extensive watch guide. You can figure out how to watch the games. And if you haven't yet, subscribe now, because you'll get the ECHL playoffs and the USHL playoffs, which will begin in a couple of weeks. And we'll talk about that one next week. So a lot of great fun on FloHockey coming your way. It does not get better than playoff hockey, and we've got a whole bunch of it for you right here on FloHockey. So do not miss it. All right, moving on from one postseason to another, this one has massive NHL draft implications, and we are talking about the 2023 IIHF World U18 Championship. And this is an event that has always been one of the most important and most scouted events of the entire season. You'll have NHL GMs going overseas, wherever it is, they are going to watch these players. And this year in particular is going to have a very strong number of players that you're going to see go very, very high in this draft. Now, they won't have Conor Bedard, who played in this tournament twice. They won't have Adam Fantilli, who's too old for the tournament. So the top 2 guys that we expect to go. Matvei Michkov will not be there either because of Russia is banned from international competition still. And so they would have been in there, and he's not going to be there. However, you've got a number of high-level players on both the U.S. and Canada for the drafts in 2023, 2024, and even 2025 based on who's on the roster. But Canada's got a bunch of NHL draft prospects, guys like Colby Barlow and Lucas Dragicevic and Andrew Crystal. There are so many really good players on that team. And then the U.S. team has perhaps the best line in all of junior hockey this year, although probably any line that Conor Bedard was on was probably the best line. But the U.S. has Will Smith, Gabe Perreault, and Ryan Leonard, all 3 together, over 40 goals each this season. Perreault and Smith went over 100 points already. They each have an opportunity to potentially break the single season record for points scored in an NTDP season, because the U.S. under-18 team is all brought from the National Team Development Program, except for a couple of players. And so that is going to be just a tremendous matchup that we are so excited to follow. The tournament begins Thursday, April 20th. And so there's going to be a lot of activity around that tournament and a lot of people watching it. It'll be on NHL Network in the U.S., but of course, it's a majorly scouted event. So I just wanted to go through a couple of other things about that tournament. And also, we've got some questions that I'll get to in just a second as well, because instead of saving all of our questions to the end of the podcast, we're going to answer them within the segments that they belong to, because I kind of put out a call for questions with some prompts and of course, as always, the Talking Hockey Sense listeners delivered. But to start us off, I just wanted to quickly go over Team USA a little bit more. As I mentioned, they have the big line of Will Smith. They have Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard all at the top. Those are the guys that are going to be very hard to stop, and those are the guys that a lot of teams are going to focus on. But if you stop that line, you've got the next line, which is led by Oliver Moore. And we just had just released on both YouTube and FloHockey a series of NHL draft profiles. And the two of the most recent ones are on Will Smith and Oliver Moore. Now, Oliver Moore has been the number 2 center on this team all year. He's not on the first power play unit. He doesn't have the numbers of the other guys, but he has very much put himself into the top 10 conversation for this draft. Might fall a little bit outside of it. We'll see exactly what happens, but we'll get to NHL Central Scouting rankings in just a little bit to dive into his stock a little bit more. But Oliver Moore is a tremendous offensive player. He's got really good talent around him. The under 18 team, which also has the under 17 team at the National Team Development Program, called up 3 players. Cole Iserman, James Higgins are the 2 forwards that they called up. They also called up Cole Hudson on defense. So you've got 2 just absolutely dynamic scoring lines. They also added from outside of the NTDP, Kerry Terrence, who is an incredibly gifted skater, has a high motor. He'll play down their lineup. He's actually a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen, but will represent the U.S. internationally. And he is, the only skater from outside the National Team Development Program that they decided to bring to this tournament. So this is a team that has increased its forward depth over the last couple of weeks through call-ups and guys that they've been able to acquire from other teams for this tournament. And then they've got really the major factor is, how does Trey Augustine hold up in net? He is one of the top goaltenders ranked for this draft coming up. He is an outstanding, he played at the World Juniors. He's got a lot of international experience. He played in this tournament as an underager last year. But, if he can be the difference, that's going to make a huge difference for the U.S. To have goaltending, that is the key. You have to have it in this tournament. They have a lot of confidence in him. He's got a lot of confidence based on his experience, and you'll also be able to hear more from him when we release his draft profile a little bit later in the month. So a very exciting Team USA squad. The defense core is probably below average for this team or for the NTDP at this tournament. They did call up Cole Hudson, but they have a number of very interesting players. Paul Fisher is going to play a ton of minutes in this thing. Aaron Menedian is going to play a lot as well. So those are players to be aware of and to know about, because they are going to have some big time minutes in this tournament. But absolutely one of my favorite events. I'm sad I won't be there this year. I've been there the last 5 years, I believe, except for the pandemic year, of course. But, it is a tremendous tournament. It's a precursor to the World Juniors and obviously a very important NHL draft event. But before we move on, I did also want to talk a little bit about Team Canada, because this is a team that absolutely has a chance. I'd say USA is the favorite for the whole tournament. They're guys that play together for most of the year, and that allows them to kind of get that chemistry going. It gives them a bit of an advantage. But Canada's roster this year is very strong, and they added some underage players as well. Max Celebrini, who you've seen on FloHockey all year, he joins Team Canada officially. He's going to miss the last little bit of the regular season for the Chicago Steel. They do have a bye in the playoffs, so they're expecting to get him back, and they'll hope to still be playing and alive there. But then there's also going to be some real talented 2023 draft eligible players. Of course, you've got Celebrini, who is 2024 draft eligible. But this team has Matt Wood back. He played at UConn this season. He accelerated his schooling to enter college at 17 years old. Youngest player in college hockey, more than held his own. He's got size, he's got strength, he's got scoring ability. That's going to be a handful for a lot of teams. They've got Callum Ritchie, who is a player that he's been hovering around that top 15, top 20 area all season long. He's going to be a major factor for this team. Andrew Crystal, big time production, and he's a player with a lot to prove at this tournament after playing for the Kelowna Rockets this year. Tanner Howe, another underager, a guy that's not draft eligible till next year. He was on the same line as Conor Bedard with the Regina Pats and had major numbers. So that's a guy that they're going to be able to lean on quite a bit. I also think that the defense is going to be a major plus for this team, and that's going to be led by Cam Allen, who's the captain of Team Canada. He was the captain at the Hlinka Gretzky Cup, which Canada won. So they are going to be a force to be reckoned with depth throughout. And then just like the U.S. has a real strong goalie, we fully expect that the starting goalie for Team Canada will be Carson Bjarnason, who played for the Brandon Wheat Kings all year long. He is the number 1 North American ranked goaltender by NHL Central Scouting. That is going to be a big spot for him to be in. He has plenty to prove himself. But if Canada gets the goaltending, as we've seen in this tournament before, they have a chance. Now, they're going to be missing many other players, guys like Zach Benson, Braden Yeager. Those are players that are not with this team. So they're missing some of the top guys and the core players. But make no mistake, this Canadian team has a real opportunity to do some damage. I mentioned it a little bit. You've got Max Celebrini. So this is a great preview, not just for the 2023 draft, but also for 2024. Celebrini, Tanner Howe, Parter Martoni. They've got a lot of really good players on that Canadian team. The U.S. has Cole Iserman, who broke the U17 goal scoring record at the National Team Development Program this year. And on Team Finland, Aaron Kiviharju, who has been the phenom that a lot of Finnish fans are extremely excited about. Bit of an undersized defenseman, but extremely mobile, highly skilled, a guy that moves pucks really well. He's going to be back in this tournament, so plenty there to get excited about with the 2024 group as well. But beyond that, this is going to be a tournament that features a lot of talent from Europe as well. Some high-end, high-level prospects. We'll be keeping a close eye on all of those guys. But we're going to also now get to your questions, because I think that will help kind of direct us a little bit further. And I'll be able to talk a little bit more about some of those European prospects that are playing. And, our first question is a good one. And I think that this is a tournament that is so important for the NHL draft. So I want to get to this one from JT. JT asks, which prospects have the most to gain at the U18s, and how similar is NHL Central Scouting's list to a team's rankings typically? I'm going to answer that second part later, because we do have a segment about the Central Scouting. But I do want to answer your question about who has the most to prove now, because I think that this is a tournament where that is absolutely, it's your last chance of game action to show scouts and general managers and some of the most important decision makers in the NHL what you're fully capable of in a high level situation. You're playing simply against your age peers. You're playing simply against, the best in the world at yours. Now, it's not a true best on best, because we are missing some of those players from Canada that would be here. There, there's other players that are not available or injured or whatever, but that's basically where we're at. We don't have a true best on best under 18 worlds, but we have a pretty darn good one. And so to answer your question, JT, I would say that pretty much everybody has something to gain from this, but I would say that the players that have the most to gain are probably the players that play European professional hockey. And I'm talking more about Edward Shala and Dalibor Dvorsky. Those are two players. You've got Shala for the Czechs, and you've got Dvorsky for Slovakia. Those are two players that have a ton to prove. They played all year in professional leagues. Dvorsky in the Allsvenskan, the Swedish second division. Shala in the Czech Pro League, which is a very difficult league for teenagers to get minutes in, to produce in. But these are two players that still have a lot of respect in this. The scouts don't look at the numbers as much. They look at the full body of work. However, at this event, both of these players are going to be viewed as top offensive contributors. They're going to be important at the other end of the ice. Those are players that can show the full complement of their abilities, because they're going to play massive minutes. And if you're an Edward Shala and you have a big tournament and you maybe get Czechia further than people expect, that says a lot about what you can do. It's a small sample, but it also allows scouts to see when he was against his age peers, he was dominant. That goes a long way. So those two guys are, I think that they're the ones that have a lot to gain. They're not the only ones, though. I think Canada's some of the defensemen, I mentioned them already. Cameron Allen started the year very highly touted as a potential first-round pick. I don't think that you'll see him on any first-round lists here in the near future. However, it's an opportunity for him, having played in a very difficult situation this year in Guelph, where they were, getting kind of buried in possession and everything else. He wasn't really able to shine. Playing on a good team, being a chance to be a leader once again. He had a very strong Holinka Gretzky Cup when he was playing at the U18 level. So getting him back in this environment could be very beneficial and remind people, what they saw earlier this season, and certainly at the end of last season. Another guy, Lukas Dragicevic, big time numbers. He was in this tournament last year as an underager, did not have much of an impact at all. I don't think he was really put in a position to succeed, but I also don't think he was quite ready for that. He's kind of a polarizing figure. There are certainly some teams that will have him as a first round draft prospect. There are others that don't. He's got, good size. He The defensive end of the spectrum for him is a little bit of a concern still. He showed this year that he can produce and has skill, but the defensive side still needs to work a little bit more. So he's a guy where he can play a leading role on this team, show that he can defend against top tier talent because he's going to go up against a lot of elite players in this tournament, and that will really go a long way. The other guys that I think really have a chance to separate themselves is not really separating themselves from the pack or the draft. It's separating themselves from each other. And that is the U.S. quartet of top tier players, of the guys we've talked about so much already: Will Smith, Ryan Leonard, Gabe Perreault, and Oliver Moore. Those are the top four guys that, you ask around to scouts and they will put them in a different order. There are people that have Ryan Leonard first. There are people that have Will Smith first. There are people that have Oliver Moore first. It's really hard to figure out, but this is a tournament where they can create a little bit of a separation. How did you perform at the most important time of the year? These guys build up 2 years to this event. It's all what that program is built up to help. That it's the crowning achievement. It's been several years since USA Hockey has won gold in this event. You have to go back to, I believe, 2017 or 2018. I mean, it's been a long time, which is not common, because they are the team that's together the longest and should have the advantage. But it's a very difficult tournament to win, especially when you get into a one and done. So to see how those guys perform at the biggest time of the year, that is going to be very important. All right. Our next question came from Kevin. And Kevin asks, Chris, what's your take on the timing of this tournament for Canada when half the kids on the team would still be in their junior playoffs? It sucks when we can't see Perron, Gauthier, Height, Jaeger, and Benson. Kevin, I agree with you. It does suck not to see those players. However, there's not a great time for this tournament. I think mid-season, what does this tournament ultimately do and accomplish? We've got the Hlinka Gretzky Cup in August, so that's an early season tournament. As we've seen time and time again, success in that tournament and what you do in that tournament doesn't necessarily is not necessarily what you're going to look like at the end of your draft season. I think for the timing of this event, it has to be at this time. Yes, you do lose players because of that, and it is unfortunate, and we have no true best on best under 18. I know Hockey Canada and TSN have said that the Hlinka Gretzky Cup is best on best. It isn't. Canada is still the only team that sends their absolute best team there. Sometimes you'll get some of the other European nations, but the U.S. never sends the national team development program to that event. So there is no best on best at the under 18 level. That said, you do get enough of the players, and is it a true measuring stick at that point? It's hard to say. I mean, but I think because the European leagues, and you have to remember that 8 of the 10 teams that participate in this tournament are not in North America, their seasons have completed. They are, for the most part, they're done. There have been a few years where, Russia had to pull a kid from the KHL playoffs, or pull from a Swedish team, got a player right off of the SHL championship or Allsvenskan championship. So that has created kind of some difficult situations for those teams where they don't have the best players. That said, because this is such an important event for the draft, I think that the NHL would certainly, it's not really their call, it's the IIHF's call, but I'm sure the NHL would balk at moving it any which way. You don't want to have it too late. You don't want to have it too early. You don't want to pull kids out mid-season. And one thing I will say, the NHL draft season for draft eligible players, and I've said it before on this podcast, is one of the most exhausting, long seasons of any year for these poor players. They basically go from August, or if you're in, at player development camps for USA Hockey, July, going into August, going into your regular season in September, and then you go nonstop. And then right after the draft, it's development camp. And right after that, you might go to World Junior Camp in about a month after that. So there's really not a lot of time built into rest. So, you couldn't really put this any other time. So it's not ideal. I do think it's the best of all worlds. The European teams and the US teams are very strong in this. Canada still has the player pool that where even if they don't have 100% of their best players, they do have enough to compete. We saw them win the tournament in Texas a couple of years ago. They were very poor last year, did not play very well, even though they had Conor Bedard last year. So this is an opportunity for a lot of those players that may not have otherwise gotten the opportunity to wear the Canadian sweater as well. And that's an important thing too. So it's a great development opportunity. It kind of mimics the World Juniors as well. So that gives them kind of preparation. But all in all, I understand your point. I agree. I just don't think there's a real great solution. All right, our last question on the under 18s comes from our pal Sports Guy, and he says, "Hey Chris, who do you favor to win the under 18 Worlds?" Well, I think that this is going to be a very interesting year. The European teams not very strong. I think Sweden has some weaknesses. Finland has some weaknesses. The Czechs and Slovakia don't have the depth. The same with the Swiss. I mean, there's just not a lot of teams that are going to be able to go toe to toe with the U.S. and Canada in this tournament. Now, the U.S. and Canada are on separate sides of the bracket. So the sooner we expect both would finish first in their groups, we would expect both of them to be on a collision course to only meet in the final. There's certainly stranger things can happen, but that's the most likely scenario. I do give the U.S. the edge. I think that their continuity, also the fact, I think they're very well coached. I think they've got the goaltending this year. I think Trey Augustine has a fire in him from how last under 18 Worlds ended. Didn't end very strongly. So I think that that's going to be the fuel for this team. Canada is going to give them all they can handle, though. That is a very good team over there. And I think that that's going to be, I think you're looking at Canada, USA 1-2, and then it'll probably be between Finland and Sweden for bronze, which it often is at this level. So Sweden won the world under 18s last year in an incredible performance against a very good U.S. team. I think the U.S. team definitely has its holes and its flaws this year, but ultimately I think that's the team to beat as everything goes. But Canada is a force to be reckoned with, and USA certainly not just simply going to walk through this tournament with that Canadian team on the other side. All right, let's get to some NHL draft talk. I mean, talking under 18s, we're pretty much talking NHL draft, but another major moment on the NHL draft calendar happened this week, and that is the release of the NHL Central Scouting final rankings. Now, there's a little bit of hand-wringing out there because why do they release it before the World Under 18s is over and before the CHL playoffs are over? There's a lot of data that and information that you can take in over these last few weeks. I think mostly it's simply because this is the Central Scouting serves a number of purposes, one of which is generating interest, and they have to get those out before the NHL draft lottery, which is on May 8th. And if you haven't seen it, the odds for that, of course, the Anaheim Ducks have the best odds to land Conor Bedard. Congratulations on finishing last in the NHL. You won. You won the opportunity. You won the best opportunity. You might still not get them. The lowest they can pick is third, but either way, the Ducks are going to guarantee themselves a franchise-changing prospect, whether it's Bedard or Fantilli or Leo Carlson or even Matvei Michkov. I think any one of those guys could really be a massive building block for their future on top of the players that they already have. And the Ducks have quite a few. But really want to give a quick summary of the rankings. And then we also got a number of questions about the Central Scouting rankings. So I want to get through that right here. And before I do that, I'm going to take a sip of water because as you can see, I'm just talking by myself right now and it gets a little dry in here and it's allergy season as well. So let's pause for one water break. All right, now let's see if we can get through the whole show without coughing. All right. So in the North American skaters, of course, Central Scouting breaks up their list. You have the North American skaters, the European skaters, the North American goalies, and the European goalies. I like this for the reason that it doesn't allow you to know exactly the full order of what Central Scouting thinks. I think it's kind of fun that way. There is no such thing as a definitive list for the draft. But what Central Scouting does is they basically try to act like the 33rd team in the NHL. They have, a number like a half dozen scouts at least. They have some people that are full-time, some people that are part-time that do that job. And they, are essentially professional scouts. They're, amateur scouts technically, because that's what the NHL refers to their scouting department as, amateur scouts. The scouts aren't amateur. The players that they're watching are. But I think that that's it creates a lot of debate. And certainly, Central Scouting is not perfect, nor is any public list, nor is any single person's list, nor is any team's list. But it does give you an idea. So no surprise as to who the number one and number two North American skaters were: Conor, Bedard, Adam Fantilli. It's been that way all year. I think the big question was, what was the rest of that list going to look like? And I'll tell you what, Central Scouting certainly made things interesting here, because the number 3 player is Will Smith from the National Team Development Program. The number 4 player is Matthew Wood, a big-time riser, had a very strong season at UConn, put together 23 or 34 points in 35 games, nearly a point per game as a 17-year-old freshman in college hockey. Really remarkable production. He also has that size factor at 6'3", 193. We have a question about Matthew Wood, so we'll get in more in depth on him, but he moves ahead of that list there, and that's pretty interesting for Central Scouting. Right after him, Ryan Leonard from the National Team Development Program. And I've had a lot of conversations lately. Ryan Leonard is the third most productive player on his line at the NTDP. However, there are a lot of teams that I've talked to that have said this guy plays a winning brand of hockey. He plays the style that you need to play in the playoffs. Now, he's with two incredibly skilled players in Will Smith and Gabe Perreault, who are more cerebral and dynamic, whereas Leonard is a goal scorer and he's physical and he goes and creates space for those guys. He does a lot of things well. The question becomes, how valuable is what he does versus what the more dynamic players do? And in the modern NHL, you'll find the answer is still very, very valuable. So that's pretty interesting. Also, a big-time riser, again, Nate Danielson playing in Brandon this year. Zach Benson was number 6. And then Danielson was number 7. So we've, a lot of WHL guys. Another interesting factor, you have to go 18th among North American skaters before you hit a defenseman on their ranking. And that's not really that shocking. We've said it for a while that this is a weak year for defensemen. If you are looking for a defenseman this season, unless you have one of the first couple of picks, there's a lot of guys that have plenty of flaws and concerns among other players. So the highest ranked defenseman for Central Scouting is actually over on the European side. So we'll quickly run down the top European players. Leo Carlson is number 1, edging out Matvei Michkov. So you got 2 great players. That's not personally the order that I would have them in, but again, you fully understand there's a lot of other factors that are going to go into picking Matvei Michkov. But Leo Carlson tops the European list. Number 3 was Dalibor Dvorsky. Number 4 is Edward Shala. And then number 5 is David Reinbacher, the highest ranked defenseman. You also go Otto Stenberg. We get another defenseman, and Axel Sandin Pellikka at 7th. Lenny Haminaho at 8. Daniel Boot at 9. And then Mikhail Gulayev at 10. That's the top 10 of the European skaters. A very interesting group of players there that I think, offer a lot. So we'll see exactly where they all end up, and also where they end up on FloHockey's final draft rankings, which will come out in May. Still working on that, and there's a lot in flux, and we've got a lot of events to go before we finish that off. All right, had to take another water break before I coughed all over my microphone. So also in the Central Scouting, wanted to bring up 61 active USHL players were ranked in Central Scouting this year. Coughed anyway. 412 total players ranked. Obviously, there aren't 412 players that are going to get drafted. So always interesting to see kind of the way that works out. And it's a lot of players. That is a lot of players. And that's why I'm really excited that we got a couple of questions that wanted to know a little bit more about this process. And while I'm not an expert in Central Scouting history, I do have a fair idea of kind of how teams utilize it and, what they ultimately do. And that's why on our first question, we are going to get into that. And this first question comes from Avco Cup. How about a bit of a general explainer on Central Scouting? How it's funded, why it's needed, how many scouts do they have, how teams use the info produced, do some teams use it more than others? Really good question, because I think it's not one that has a very clear 100% answer. because NHL teams do use it. It's a guide to a certain extent. I think one of the most valuable things that Central Scouting does on an annual basis is try to identify the pool of players via their watch lists and things like that. So for somebody like me that analyzes the draft and prospects as a, and there's the entire world to track, they're giving me a bit of a list as a guide. Now, obviously I've got a lot of players that I've already kind of seen and have ideas about, but Central Scouting will allow to help fill those cracks. And it does the same thing for NHL teams. I've talked to a lot of scouts that said, the biggest thing is when the Central Scouting list comes out and there's a player on their list that we don't have on ours, oftentimes a scouting director or assistant GM, or maybe even the GM will say, hey, they have this guy this high. How come we don't have him at all? And then there's also then the discussion goes, but the team is always going to rely on the people that they hired to do those jobs, and their opinions are going to matter far more. The thing about Central Scouting is that sometimes general managers get involved in the situation, and they might have their own ideas and they don't see the players as much. And if they're not as comfortable delegating to their scouts, that could complicate things sometimes. It doesn't happen often, but it's certainly something that I've heard before from NHL teams. But let's just break down our friend Avco Cup's question a little bit more directly here. So, how it's funded. I mean, the guys that work for NHL Central Scouting are paid by the league. They're NHL employees. They have NHL, email addresses. They some of them are full time. Dan Marr, of course, is the director. You have Goran Stub, who's run the European Central Scouting, the European Bureau of Central Scouting. They keep those separate lists, and Goran Stub kind of more in charge of that list. Dan Marr more in charge of not just the North American list, but all of them, but certainly has the largest say in the North American list. They have area scouts just like NHL teams do. There are people that cover the WHL specifically. There are people that cover the US. And so that's changed. There have been many people in the department. There have been fewer. I couldn't give you an exact count of the number of people that work there right now, but they try to operate like that 33rd NHL team. How, and then as far as how teams use the info produced, as I said, it's kind of a guide. It gives you a chance to fill some cracks. It gives you a chance to, it's a second opinion more than anything. There are definitely some teams that are not wanting you to look at that, their scouts to look at that. They feel like it can sometimes cloud the judgment. It can, kind of put a little bit of bias in your mind. That's, that happens. But, I would say that by and large, a lot of the teams, that it's an extra bit of information, because I can tell you, like, I'm an independent draft person. Sorry, everybody. I'm an independent draft person, and people have said that they looked at my list, or they had Corey Pronman's list, or they had Elite Prospects list, or they put them all up, and it's all just for extra opinion. And the other thing that it's really good for, because one of the things that teams do is they try to get a finger on the pulse of what everybody thinks, right? Because you don't need to know. You want to have your list, and you want to have it as locked down as you can possibly have it. But you also need to have an idea of what other teams are thinking about players. And so sometimes these outside exterior lists like the one that Bob McKenzie makes, where he gets opinions from actual NHL scouts and polls them anonymously, those become important for understanding what's out there. And so if you say, well, we really like this guy at, we hope we're drafting 20th, but boy, it seems like the buzz around this guy just keeps continuing to grow. There's a lot of gossip in the scouting community too. It's like, oh, like where is he going to go? What's going to happen? And so that can impact things like trading up, or it can impact things like they take all of that information. They try to create, the scenario where it's like, hey, we think this guy's going to go a lot higher. We might want to move up. Those are the types of things that it can be beneficial for. It's not 100%, but there are definitely teams that use it in that way. So really good question. And I think, Central Scouting serves an important purpose for the public as well, because it's an independent professional list that is created by professional people that, have scouting experience. And, certainly people like myself and others, we may not have worked on the team side, but, there's some level of experience that kind of goes into what we've done. But these guys, their job is they're paid to strictly make these lists and go watch players. So that's a totally different thing than what we do. And that's what makes Central Scouting pretty valuable. All right, our next question here comes from F, and it says, "Hi, Chris. Love your work. Thank you very much. We always talk about the top 10 or top 64 prospects for the draft. Do you have any players that you think will be drafted later that could be a steal, 4th to 7th round? Any favorites?" Well, I actually decided to use Central Scouting as a guide for this to see how they feel relative to some of the players that I really like. And one player that I saw that was very far down their list on on Central Scouting at 220th among North American skaters is Gabriel Stewarts, who plays for the Kelowna Rockets. Really good player, I think. He is a 2003 birth date, so he is an overage for this draft. He is definitely, I wouldn't say a high profile or high upside prospect, but I do think that he's a player that's worth a draft pick. And if you watched him this season with Kelowna, he took a major step offensively. He has good enough skill. He had 79 points in 56 games in the WHL this year after 41 last season. Was a big part of the Czech team that won the silver medal at the World Juniors this season. He had 8 points on that team. He's got a bit of a spark plug, energetic kind of style to him, and then he's also got good skills. So what does he not have? He's not an amazing skater at 5'10" or close to 5'11", but he is absolutely a guy that I think, based on the season that he's had, based on the trajectory that he's shown over the last couple of years playing in North America, although he did not have any points in the playoffs, which that could impact a person. I think that this is a player that could go in the upper middle, the middle rounds, the middle late rounds, like the 5th round kind of thing. I think there's going to absolutely be a team that will take him, and I think that having him at 220th, while that's their opinion, that's fine. I just don't think that that's exactly. I think this is a player that has enough buzz. So that's one player that I like quite a bit in terms of what we're seeing. Another thing that I do for those late round guys is I look for players that I think, if they're not picked in this draft, where do I think they'll go? Or do I think they'll become college free agents? That's another thing that I usually use as a guide is will they become a college free agent down the road? And that one guy, I've said it last year and this year, I wouldn't draft him until much later, but Zach Wisdom from the Cedar Rapids Rough Riders is definitely a player that I can see getting drafted. He had a big offensive season. He's physical. He's quick, good on the forecheck, really good work ethic on the ice. I think that there are definitely what's holding him back is I don't think he makes enough plays. He's doesn't necessarily see it as well as other players, but the motor and the size and the just getting in on the forecheck and being physical and being disruptive, that's something that I think you can value. And that's a guy where, if you just let him go to college, he's committed to Colorado College, in a couple of years, you might be offering him a max ELC because a lot of teams are interested in him as a college free agent. So I think a lot of teams are starting to do that now, where they're taking re-entry players, guys like Wisdom, and they're saying, hey, let's get him. We got a better book on him now. Let's get him. Otherwise, we might have to compete for him later. And I think that that's a number of teams have invested in that strategy of looking at those overage players. So guys like Stewarts and Wisdom are, re-entry players that you can get a better feel for. So really fascinated to see where those guys go. Those are two of the guys that I like, that I don't necessarily think will be particularly high draft picks. All right. I always like these two because they make me critique other lists, and I don't necessarily like to do that, but this is a good question from Luke nonetheless. Luke asks, Central Scouting had Matthew Wood higher than expected and Riley Heidt a bit lower than I expected. Your opinion on why? Well, I think, anytime you look at this, and again, this is their opinion, and I haven't made my final list yet, so I can't tell you definitively if I'll have Riley Heidt higher than Matthew Wood. I think that having Wood 4th is pretty aggressive, but it's not out of the question because I think there's a lot of things to like about his game. And we'll get into that a little bit more now. Now, Matthew Wood's about 6'3.5", close to 200 pounds. Good power forward, really good down low, has good hands, and he can score. So when you have a player that has size on top of that, plays well down low, and has hands, that is something that is a little bit harder to find. Riley Height has, well, a lack of height. Not that he's a small player, but, I think that that's a reason why he might be a little bit lower. He's at 5'10", so he's below average on the size spectrum. His skating has been a concern throughout the year. He's an incredible playmaker. I mean, he makes a lot of plays in a game, and I think that's why a lot of public lists and certainly a reason that I have a lot of time for him is that he sees the ice extremely well. He makes good decisions with the puck, and he is decisive. And so that's really key. But the question is if you don't have the pace and you don't have the size, that is usually the combo that becomes very scary for scouts. It doesn't bother me as much if you have the hockey sense to go with it. We're talking hockey sense, right? Shameless plug of the show title, but that's a hugely valued trait. And I think if you were to look at those two players, Height might have the hockey sense advantage, but what does Wood have? He has a size advantage. He's skilled enough. His feet aren't amazing either. I don't think his pace is very good, but he's got the size to make up for it and then the scoring ability. So that's where I see, NHL teams are still valuing size. They're still valuing that heaviness and being difficult to play against. I talked to a scout months ago now about how good Wood is down low. Everything below the goal line, he wins a lot of puck battles. He's good at the net front. He can score from distance as well. So he can beat you a lot of different ways. I think that's a reason why he's been a riser throughout the year. So very good question. Two, players on very different ends of the spectrum in terms of size and everything like that. But I think they're two really, really interesting players. So like where they're at, and a great question. I really appreciate that question. All right. Here's another fun one. This one is from Aaron, and we're going to get a little bit in depth on this because it involves the two players that everyone's really excited about. And that, of course, is Conor Bedard and Adam Fantilli. So Aaron asks, which lottery team would be the best fit for Bedard and Fantilli, in your opinion? Now, the cop-out answer would be to say all of them, because you can make yourself instantly better by having one of those two players on your roster at the center position. I don't know for 100% certainty that Conor Bedard will be an NHL center due to the size and everything like that. I think you want him to have the puck as much as humanly possible. And yeah, sure, he'll probably end up down the middle as a high end goal scorer, but it's not, 100%. So that's one thing to kind of keep an eye on. So for me, I actually think if a lot of teams in that range, if you get Conor Bedard, you're ecstatic. You're in a different, you look at the Ducks. If they get Conor Bedard, then they have tremendous, tremendous skill at their disposal. They have, Bedard. They would have Trevor Zegras, Troy Terry. You look at Mason McTavish, who's more of the brawny guy, but he still has skill. And then they have really talented defense. I think that the issue is like all of a sudden you're saying, okay, well, we need to get bigger at some point if you're the Ducks as well. Even though McTavish has good strength, he's not necessarily a giant. You still need size up front, especially when you have lighter forwards like a Zegras and like a Terry, which is why I think actually Fantilli at 6'2", a guy that's closing in on 200 pounds, a guy that plays with a bit of a mean streak, I think he'd be a great fit for Anaheim. So if they don't get Conor Bedard, I think Fantilli is a really nice fit for Anaheim. To me, I think Columbus could use either of them. And I actually, again, you've got Johnny Gaudreau and Patrick Laine. You've got some guys throughout. And I think, Conor Bedard would be a great fit there. To go into a team that already has a little bit more of a veteran presence around, I think helps. And so Columbus, to me, is one of those teams that could compete for a playoff spot as soon as next season. Now, they need to have some goaltending. You have to have Zach Werenski healthy. You have to have your decor. But I think David Jiricek comes in and makes an impact immediately. I love the way that he played in the AHL this year. I think he's going to make a presence. You wouldn't want to have to lean on a player like him, but say, okay, you've got Johnny Gaudreau, we've got Patrick Laine, who's, if he's healthy, he can, and the top of his game, he can make a big presence. And then you've got, Conor Bedard. How do you stop that group? And then if you're Columbus at that point, you do get Connor Bedard. You say, how much else can we put around him? How do we fix the goaltending situation? How do we get everything in order? But those are teams that I think are absolutely in the mix to, make a significant impact. And really, I mean, the same kind of goes for everybody. Again, I'd say, the cop out is to say all of the teams, because, Connor Bedard is going to make any single team better. I think that if you're San Jose and you get Connor Bedard, you say, okay, well, we've got some guys that can play with some size and some pace, and that we have some infrastructure. All of a sudden, it makes a 100-point defenseman in Erik Karlsson that much more valuable. So that's key as well. But I mean, it's really interesting to kind of sort through these teams. How much of a difference could a guy like a Connor Bedard make in Philadelphia? They haven't had a player like that. I mean, Claude Giroux was a tremendous player and just a franchise, just cornerstone for so long there. Of course, he's now long gone, but you look at a Connor Bedard going into Philly, I mean, it changes the whole dynamic and whole outlook of your organization. Now, the interesting factor would be, how does Connor Bedard and John Tortorella get along? That seems like that might not be the best match. But, what if you put Connor Bedard with Alex Ovechkin and Washington? I mean, like, it's amazing to think of the possibilities that exist here. Of course, there are only 10 teams that can make the first overall pick, because you can only move up 10 spots. And the longest odds belong to the Vancouver Canucks, which is the team that Connor Bedard grew up rooting for. And to have gone through so many years with the Sedin brothers, and then to maybe have a chance at Connor Bedard, and then have a 1-2 punch of Connor Bedard and Elias Pettersson for however long, I mean, we're talking a very instant competitiveness for them. But as I mentioned, I think Fantilli is a really good fit for any of those teams as well. Particularly, I think he'd be a great fit for the Ducks stylistically within the Western Conference. He has good speed. He's got the physicality. He's a guy that would make an impact there. But I think when you finish last in the league, there's always the chance you lose the draft lottery, and they have a very real chance. And I think, if you end up with Adam Fantilli out of that mix, you're gonna be really happy. I think they'd be happy too with Leo Carlsson as well, and that would get some size in their group as well. But those are the teams that I think we need to kind of focus on, because they're the most likely. But yeah, I mean, these are two players that are going to make a humongous impact no matter where they go. But hopefully, I didn't completely cop out on that answer. Well, we want to keep it short and sweet today, and I think I even kept it a little bit longer than I wanted to. But before we get out of here, and there's a lot more to come. Again, USHL playoffs are coming up. We will talk about that. We will get more into the Under-18 World Championship as the tournament progresses next week. We'll also be talking more about the ECHL Kelly Cup playoffs, AHL Calder Cup playoffs. I mean, there is so much to get to beneath the NHL right now. It is just a tremendous time of year. But before we got out of here, I did want to take a couple of seconds. A bit of a sad note, if you are familiar with prospects, or you're familiar with Seattle hockey, you probably know Andy Ide, and have heard his name, and you've probably read his work, or maybe you've heard his voice. And we lost Andy this week. He had suffered a stroke actually at getting ready to cover a Seattle Kraken game. And unfortunately, Andy did not recover, and he passed away. But this is a guy that, I got to know through the digital medium, talking hockey, and then going on his podcast, Sound of Hockey, and going on, he was a big voice in the WHL, especially in the US. He worked for the Seattle Thunderbirds as a color analyst for a while, and just a great human being, somebody that you love to be around, somebody that you really love to hear from, and somebody that I think made everybody that came into his orbit feel welcome. And that is probably the best compliment you can give anybody. How did you treat other people? And Andy treated people like gold, because he was a gold person himself. I mean, he was just an absolute beauty, as we say in hockey. And he is going to be so sorely missed. And my heart goes out to everybody that loved Andy, because that is a very, very large group. Especially my pals at the Sound of Hockey podcast, Darren and John, who lost a co-host, and also just a tremendous friend. And as I watched the Seattle Kraken win their first playoff game, couldn't help but think of Andy, and how much I wish that he was able to be there for that, because I'm sure he was watching, but that it was hard knowing that, he put in so much work, and it really made his life, that the Kraken were there. He covered them for the NHL.com and a number of other outlets. And yeah, we're just going to miss him a whole bunch. And so, Andy, wherever you are, buddy, we're thinking of you, and we love you. And, we're definitely going to miss you. Well, yeah, that's about it for this week, everybody. I really appreciate you stopping by. Thanks to everybody that asked questions. Huge thanks to Nico Reyna for producing this here podcast, doing a great job and getting those tweets up on the screen that you saw there, and also helping me with my technical difficulties, which apparently I'm old now. So, but thanks a lot to Nico for that. And thanks to you for listening. I really do appreciate it, listening or watching wherever you may be. Hope that you are enjoying the podcast. We're going to have a lot more coming up. We've got a lot to get to, so don't miss any more episodes. You can go on FloHockey.tv. You can go on YouTube. You can download us wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you are finding Talking Hockey Sense. You're listening to it, you're watching it, and you're staying up to date on everything in the prospect world. I'm so glad you could join me this week. That's going to do it for now. My name is Chris Peters. This is Talking Hockey Sense. We'll catch you next time.